Hi, my name is Lauren Cummings, and my biological control project is on reproductive control. Now, I bet you have a lot of questions on how we as scientists control reproduction. But before we can talk about this or even begin to understand reproductive control, we must understand the process that led us to this technology, which is eugenics. Now, does anyone know who the father of eugenics is? I'll wait. If you said Sir Francis Galton, then you would be correct. Francis Galton, born in 1882, died in 1911, is the father of the modern quantitative genetics, and he invented and defined the terminology of the scientific field eugenics. Eugenics is the science of improving a human population controlled by controlled breeding to increase the occurrence of desirable inheritable characteristics. Developed largely by Francis Galton as a method of improving the human race. Heredity in genetics was not always Sir Galton's scientific concentration. His passion of mathematics led him to the field of geography on mapping and meteorological observations. Sir Galton was about 40 years old when his cousin, Charles Darwin, made some new discoveries that encouraged him to inquire more about the topic of heredity. This newfound science reinvigorated him to where he could write and publish Hereditary Genius. However, one of his most famous publications in regards to human genetics is English Men of Science, Their Nature and Nurture. Now, we will talk about eugenics regarding Sir Galton's timeline. In the 1870s, Sir Galton performed a study on affluent men in England. He placed great emphasis on statistical measurements of their hereditary predispositions, as well as predicting and improving the population. This was his way of predicting and improving the population. In 1874, he published English Men of Science, Their Nature and Nurture. However, Sir Galton received a lot of criticism for only using affluent men in his research for his book, but he confirmed that his aim was not to create an aristocratic elite, but of a population that consists entirely of superior men and women. In 1884, which is in the 1880s, he established anthropometric, which is the Greek term for human, laboratory. So the anthropometric laboratory was established in 1884. Between the 1880s and 1890s, almost 17,000 people visited and paid for the privilege to be tested. The test was to measure the mental abilities, their height, weight, strength, rate of movement, visual and auditory acuity, and reaction times of the subject test. Sir Galton believed that there was a consistent correlationship between sensory and mental acuity. In 1882, due to Sir Galton's advancements in hereditary, the Scotland Yard found that fingerprints was an ideal index for personality identity. In 1883, he published Inquiries into the Human Faculty and its Developments. This is one of the first times he used eugenics in one of his books. In 1889, he also published Natural Inheritance. In the early 90s, he founded the Eugenics Society of Great Britain in 1908. And in 1909, he started a monthly journal that called the Eugenics Review, and he was also knighted Sir Francis Scott Galton by King Edward. Unfortunately, in 1911, Sir Francis Galton, the father of eugenics, passed away. We will now talk about two countries that in the 20th century disgracefully used Sir Galton's eugenics concept for their own personal gain. Unfortunately, the first country I will talk about is the United States of America. Americans would flaunt their Caucasian genes and their better babies they would bear, while sterilizing those who were less or those who were deemed less worthy of a family. The American Eugenics Society was an organization that began in the early 1900s. Its mission not only included segregation, but a racial cleansing and establishment of a strong, pure race, untainted by the blood of those that were deemed lesser, whether by race or by disability. This meant the practice of forced sterilization for those who were deemed unfit to have a family, such as the following: people with learning disabilities, people in institutions, interracial couples, especially if found married, since it was illegal in the United States at this time. Forced sterilization of orphans, cripples, and the feeble-minded. Now, how would you know if someone's feeble-minded? But that was in the case. This practice supposedly ended in World War II. However, we'll get more onto that later. If you notice at the top right-hand corner, you will see a plaque dedicated in North Carolina to commemorate a historical site in which the Eugenics Board was active in sterilization by force or coercion of over 76,000 people from the years of 1933 to 1973. Here is some eugenics propaganda from the United States at the time. If you notice on the left, this is another plaque stating that Indiana Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to have this eugenics law. However, it was re-put in the 14th Amendment to reinstate sterilization among the court appeals, but it added court appeals. Approximately 2,500 total people in state custody were sterilized. Repeal of all sterilization laws in 1974 finally happened, but in 1977, related restrictive marriage laws still were repealed, or still had to be repealed in a sense. Now I'll move my camera over so you can see the picture of the legislative status of eugenical sterilization in the United States in 1935. Everything that has color in it, especially the black ones, the states that has bills pending the laws requiring the repeal. However, the ones that have the slashes, they're all laws that are in effect as of January 31st, 1935. However, we cannot finish talking about Americans' use of eugenics without talking about Margaret Sanger and Planned Parenthood. On October 16, 1916, Margaret Sanger opened the first birth control clinic in the United States. She was an advocate for women's reproductive rights, and she was a vocal advocate for eugenics and an enthusiast. Due to her checkered past, 25 of the House of Representative Republicans campaigned to have her bust as a pioneered family planner removed from the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery. This was because it was found and featured in the same exhibit as American civil rights leaders. Ted Cruz's office issued a press release saying she did not belong there for a number of reasons, the most damning of which is the part of her inhumane life's work. She was an advocate for the extermination of African Americans. On the right, you will see more pictures of Margaret Sanger and some of the distasteful things that she said against blacks, families, and people in general. For instance, at the bottom, you can see where she says inferior races like Orientals, Jews, and blacks. She referred to them as human weeds. The second country that is misunderstood and misused Sir Galton's field of study was Nazi Germany. Big shocker there. One of the main goals of Nazi Germany was creating a so-called master race. It was horrible time in history, but contrary to popular belief, the Nazi Germans did not invent the idea of a master race or eugenics in period. Americans did. Hitler would later say, "There is today one state in which at least weak beginnings toward a better contraception and are noticeable. It is not our model German Republic, but the United States." How sad, how sad. On July 14, 1933, the Nazi dictatorship fulfilled their lifelong dreams of eugenic proponents by enacting the law of prevention of genetically diseased offspring, breeding a voluntary sterilization law drafted by Parisian health officials in 1932. Individuals were subjugated to the law who were, regardless if they were men or women. They suffered from any of these 9 conditions, then they were considered to have to do voluntary sterilization. One of these conditions are feeble-mindedness, schizophrenia, manic depressive disorder, genetic epilepsy, Huntington's chorea, which is fetal dementia, genetic blindness, genetic deafness, severe physical deformity, and chronic alcoholism. So if you had one of these 9, as they say, disgraceful traits, then you were required to be sterilized. Here is some photos of propaganda in Nazi Germany. Now, I don't read German, but the middle picture is from the Anne Frank Museum. I've actually been to this museum, so I know exactly about this part. This is showing how they would look at eye drooping at the very top. If the eyes drooped too low, they would sterilize them. If their chin was not proper, they would sterilize them. If their fingers were not properly 5 fingers with no extra crookedness or deformity, they would sterilize them. I will move this camera over one more time so you can see the picture on the right. And this shows how height deformity and what they considered to be worse. So, as we go on. So how do we go from reproductive control, from eugenics to designer babies? That seems like a lot. But I believe we are missing a step in the process, which is assistive reproductive technologies. But we will talk about that in a moment. So, let's recap. Francis Galton definition of eugenics. He defined the term of eugenics as the science of improving inherited stock, not only by judicious mating, but also by influences which gave more suitable strains a better chance, which meaning the term was sometimes coined as the field of hereditary improvement. Modern day definition of eugenics can be defined as the use of science applied to qualitative and quantitative improvement of the human genome. Now, what is genetically modified humans / designer babies? The process of intentionally altering human DNA for the process of producing desired genetic traits, meaning it has nothing to do with the person being sick or an ailment or anything. This is purely for physical means or mental improvements. Below you can see a small timeline. So in 1883, eugenics was born. In 1998, the Journal of the Medical Ethics modernized the term eugenics, and in 2004, designer baby was added to the Oxford English Dictionary. So, I have gotten back to the famous assistive reproductive technologies, or ART. I will not call it that the whole time. Before we can talk about genetically modified humans, we will first have to talk about assistive reproductive technologies. Because without this form of human engineering, designer babies would still be a scientific concept. ART is a form of reproductive control because the physician is directly manipulating the normal contraception process. ART is a technology used to achieve pregnancy in procedures such as fertility, artificial improvement, in vitro fertilization, and surrogacy. Reproduction technologies used primarily for fertility treatments. However, in this case, we will stick to the understanding the different types of inseminations like the following. Intrauterine insemination, which is at the top right-hand corner, you can see a picture of. And I'll move my picture down so you can see it more. So this is a picture of intrauterine insemination. And basically how this works is at the time of ovulation, sperm are injected directly up into the uterus. Medicine is given to the woman first to increase the number of eggs she releases. In vitro fertilization involves sperm are mixed with multiple eggs collected from the woman in a test tube or a plastic dish, then fertilized, and then placed back into the uterus. IVF requires some type of viable sperm though. Then we have intracytoplasmic sperm injections. A single sperm is injected through a tiny needle into an egg. The fertilized egg is implanted into the uterus, and ICS is only performed when there is an abnormality or extreme low sperm count. Our next one is intravaginal insemination. It is when you place sperm directly inside the vagina near the cervix. This is commonly used when there are male ejaculate problems, surrogacy, or donor sperm utilization. Intracervical insemination pretty much sounds like what it says. You put the sperm in the cervix. Intratubal insemination, again, sounds like what it says. You put the sperm into the fallopian tubes. So those are all the other forms of in vitro or insemination, or basically all the ways the ART technologies can be used. Now, how did we go from IVF to designer babies? We didn't, but we're starting to get close. So next is IVF and pre-implantation of genetic diagnosing. Now, that sounds like a lot. So basically, this is the process of engineering a child with specific traits is not far-fetched. IVF has become increasingly common procedure to help couples enhance with fertility problems, to conceive children. To practice of IVF confers with the ability to pre-select embryos before implantation. Did you hear me when I said that? IVF confers the ability to pre-select embryos before implantation. Does that not sound like reproductive control? We'll keep going. However, for example, I'm going to give you an example. Pre-implantation genetics, or PGD, allows viable embryos to be screened for various traits such as sex-linked disease or before implanting them into the mother. Through PGD, the physician can select the embryos that are not predisposed to certain genetic conditions. Now, did you hear me again? The physician can select the embryos that are not predisposed to the certain genetic conditions. That also sounds like what? Eugenics. For this reason, PGD is commonly used in medicine when parents carry genes that place their children at risk for serious diseases such as cystic fibrosis or sickle cell anemia. Present technology capabilities point that PGD is most likely the method for selecting traits. Since scientists have not established a reliable means of in vivo embryonic gene selection, this will be the way we will start. Now I will move my camera over one more time. So you can just see an insemination process. Now this is true IVF. Basically, the eggs are aspirated, they're inseminated into a petri dish. Incubation period time takes a minute, and then it's transferred back. The embryo itself is transferred back into the cervix and uterus. Sound pretty simple, right? Well, let's see if there's any examples of how we can get that pre-implantation genetic diagnosing to start turning into designer babies. Well, there is one well-known case. The case of Monique and Scott Collins in 1996. They went to the Genetics and IVF Institute in Fairfax, Virginia for an in vitro fertilization method. Now, the Collins intended to conceive a girl as their first 2 children were boys, and the couple wanted a daughter in the family. Now, this was one of the first highly publicized instances of PGD turning into eugenics, basically, wherein which the selection of the embryo was not performed to address a specific medical condition, but to fulfill the parents' desire to create a more balanced family. The Collins' decisions to have a designer baby by choosing the sex of their child entered the public vernacular when they were featured in Time magazine in 1999 article, Designer Babies. Though the Collins case only involved gender, it raised a lot of ethical issues in the selection for other traits, such as eye color, hair color, athleticism, height. They're not generally related to health issues of a child, so how can we ethically say that it's just pre-implantation genetic diagnosis? It's not. It is eugenics. Or, in another form, reproductive control. Here's a younger picture of Miss Jessica Collins that was featured in the Time magazine. She was perfectly healthy at the time and had no issues, as far as we know. Now, 21st century medical practices. We know the 20th century was a little shaky when it came to eugenics. But hopefully the 21st century has understood that this is not about creating a better race or better group of people or a society of aristocratic elite. It's more about helping people who have actual genetic disorders that they do not want to pass on to their children. So here's an example of how eugenics can be used for removal of a genetic medical condition. Roughly about 1,000 to 4,000 children are born in the United States each year will develop a mitochondrial disease, most by the age of 10. Symptoms can range from mild to devastating. These diseases typically prevent mitochondria from converting food to energy. Now, what do we need to survive? Energy. Back to the story. And are the result of the genetic abnormalities. Although some cases can be caused by exposure of toxins, most are genetic. Disorders caused by mutations in the mitochondrial DNA are passed down by the mother. Dang it. That's all right. But okay. The procedure of this is, the procedure involves removing the nuclear material from the egg or embryo of the woman with the inherited mitochondrial disease and inserting it into the healthy egg or embryo of the donor whose own nuclear material has been discarded. Any offspring would carry the genetic material from 3 people. Not 1, not 2, but 3. That sounds a little weird, but hey. They will carry the nuclear DNA of the mother and father, but the mitochondrial DNA of the donor. At this time, we have no clue what problems or attributes that can have for those type of children. Eugenics in the 21st century. What is happening next? Well, Currently in the United States, scientists, scholars, policymakers have all used a completely different methodology in eugenics, especially regarding eugenics ethical factors. Thank God. They believe that the application for eugenics should only apply to human genetic engineering to treat medical conditions in people, not for personal gain. You get it? Makes sense. They also express the following ideas. They should not use these techniques to manipulate genetic traits of future children. And they also should not use genetic modification of sperm, eggs, or early embryos. They should be completely strictly off limits because we have no idea what the repercussions of this could be. So what have we learned? I know it was a lot, but it's all in the genes, as they say. Eugenics is the science of improving a human population by controlled breeding to increase the occurrence of desirable traits from inherited characteristics. Okay. Eugenics was developed largely by Francis Galton as a method of improving the human race. All right. Eugenics had a very shuddering past, not only in the United States, but also in Nazi Germany. It's a real sad time for the U.S. Assistive reproductive technologies is the milestone that made designer babies a realistic venture. Without it, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. Through PGD, scientists have already been using eugenics regarding eliminate genetic disorders. How we talked about the mitochondrial disease, through removing that from the mother's mitochondrial DNA. So basically, eugenics today is pretty unclear at this point. But in my opinion, it is inevitable because as soon as the morality and the ethical complications decrease, more people would feel comfortable with having a designer baby. Thank you for listening to my presentation on reproductive control. Here's my work cited. Okay, that was 20.